What's up, guys? So I've been driving my Model 3 for about 7 months now, and in that time I've covered about 13,000 kilometers worth of driving. So all in all, I've totally kind of adjusted my driving behavior to match my electric car in terms of, having to plan the routes with regards to charging and charging stations, having to add on that extra amount of time whenever I'm planning a long trip, and also just getting used to things like the performance and not using the brakes as much, not having to deal with stuff like handbrakes and changing gears. So it really is an entirely different type of experience. So this week I decided I was going to challenge myself and see what it would be like if I actually went back to driving an ICE car for a week. So in this regard, I was really going to try and test how different my driving behavior has become from driving the Tesla with things like autopilot and whatnot, versus having to go back to a traditional ICE car with a manual gearbox and a traditional handbrake and all that type of stuff. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting test, and we'll see how it goes. So let's get started. So first off, you're probably wondering, well, what on earth kind of an internal combustion engine car did Richard get to compare against his Tesla Model 3? Well, unfortunately, I don't have some super expensive supercar that we could do a direct head-to-head comparison with, but instead I got something that would be more suited towards the average 23-year-old driver, and that is a Seat Ibiza. So this particular Seat Ibiza is a €23,000 FR version, which is apparently their sport model. So I think it's got a 1 litre petrol engine with 95 horsepower. So not exactly sporty, but sure, there you go. It's a super mini car. So I guess that's about as sporty as you're going to get in that price range. So I guess the first difference that you're really going to notice compared to the Tesla when you're going back to an internal combustion engine car is definitely the keys, because using the Tesla, I'm so used to just carrying around my phone instead of having a key in my pocket that when I had to go back to this, it was very strange to have something else in my pocket where there usually wouldn't be anything. So yeah, that was definitely a big change. And also having to actually manually lock and unlock the car was another big thing, because obviously with the Tesla, when you get out and walk away from the car, it actually locks the car automatically for you as you walk away. Whereas with this, I had to keep reminding myself that I need to actually get out the keys and lock the car, because half the time I'd end up in the middle of a supermarket or something and then suddenly realise, oh my god, I'm after forgetting to lock the car. So yeah, that was something I really needed to get used to. Then obviously when you sit into the car, you've got another big difference, and that is actually having to use the key to start it. And I mean, obviously when you sit into the Tesla, it's literally you sit in, you flick the driver's stalk down and you go. That's it. Whereas in this, you actually have to get out the key, and then you have to insert it into the ignition, and then you have to put your foot on the clutch, and then you have to switch the car on, and then you have to switch the car into gear, and then you have to put down the handbrake and all this type of stuff. So it's basically like almost doing a pre-flight checklist or something. There's so many different things that you need to remember. And when you've been driving a Tesla for so long, it's just like you forget basically all the stuff that you used to have to do that you no longer have to do when you have the Tesla. Okay, so now that we're on the road, the first major big thing you're going to notice between the Tesla and this is obviously the gear changes and the power, or rather the lack of any power. So in the Tesla, when I put my foot down on the accelerator, I kind of pre-prepare myself, unbeknownst to myself, by shoving myself back into the seat like this, so that my head doesn't slam back really quickly. Whereas in this, when I put my foot down, it's just like, am I even moving? Am I accelerating? Aside from the noise that the engine starts making, the car doesn't really move that much more quickly. So there is a massive difference in terms of just the instant torque and the performance that you get from the Model 3 versus this. Now obviously I'm very much well aware of the fact that this has less than 100 horsepower, whereas my Model 3 has 500 horsepower. But even so, just comparing a traditional ICE car from the perspective of having an engine versus an electric motor, you're definitely going to notice the difference that instant torque of having an electric motor makes versus having a standard internal combustion engine car. So that's definitely one big thing to point out. The next big thing, of course, as well, is having to change gears, because the main thing about the acceleration I find in the Model 3 isn't actually the initial oomph that you get. It's more so when you start going past the 30, 40, 50 kilometer an hour mark, because the car just keeps accelerating. as opposed to something like this where you have the gears. You go up one gear, you get to like 5,000, 6,000 revs or whatever, and then the speed starts tapering off. Whereas in the Tesla, it actually just keeps accelerating and accelerating the faster the car gets. So that's another huge difference as well between the Tesla and having an ICE car, is just the fact that it keeps accelerating no matter how fast you're going. And speaking of filling up your car with petrol or charging it up at a charging station, that brings us to our next point in the video, which is long distance driving. So if you watched my previous video, which was about my trip from Limerick to Donegal, you'll remember that it took me about 6 hours and 45 minutes to drive in the Tesla from Limerick to Donegal because of all the issues I had with charging the car. Now, it wasn't a trip that I could do on one full charge, because in the Tesla I get about 350 kilometers worth of range, and the entire trip itself was actually, I think, 356 kilometers. So I wouldn't have been able to do it in one go. I had to stop at a charging station. And of course, the charging stations that I did stop off at, 3 of them were actually broken. So that really contributed to making the trip a lot longer. Whereas comparing it to this, I could have done the trip in one go and not have had to stop off anywhere. So for long distance journeys, it's definitely something I noticed, because shortly after I got this car, I actually had to drive down from Dublin to Limerick, and it was just such a relief to not have to plan the journey and not say, okay, I'm going to have to stop off at the Tesla supercharging station in Bird Hill for 40 minutes to charge the car, and then again when I get home charge it again. So it really does make a big difference, and it is something that I actually hadn't really noticed until coming back to a car like this, just how convenient it is to be able to just go to any petrol station nearby and just fill it up with petrol in about 3 minutes. So that is a big difference. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, well, I mean, yes, it is more convenient to fill up your car with petrol than it is to charge it, but then it's also way cheaper to charge your car than it is to fill it up with petrol. But that isn't exactly the case anymore, because now that the ESB have introduced charges for using all of their charging stations across the country, including both slow and fast chargers, there isn't actually that much of a difference in terms of pricing. Because when you think about it, if you have a car like a Tesla Model 3, for example, or if you have something like a Hyundai Kona, then to charge it up, it's going to cost about 20 to 25 euros. And with that, you're going to get about 350 to 400 kilometers worth of range. So if you compare that to, say, something like a standard diesel car, which costs about 60 euros to fully fill it up, and with that you'll get about 1,000 kilometers worth of range, then doing the maths, there isn't much of a difference. You're looking at about 60 euros to fill up your car with electricity versus about 60 euros to fill up your car with diesel to cover the same amount of distance. Unless you're charging at home, then there isn't really that much of a difference in terms of cost anymore. So now that we've covered a lot of the basics, one other thing you're definitely going to notice when you first get into this car is the fact that the interior just looks so much more complicated. So despite the fact that this car costs about a third of what the Tesla costs, and it's got way less features and functions, it actually seems to look like it's got way more functionality than the Tesla does, simply because it's got so many buttons and so many different icons scattered all over the place. I mean, to the left and right of the gear stick, you've got all these little things that look like buttons but aren't actually buttons, and then you've got stuff for like locking the car and turning off the start-stop function when you're in stop and go traffic. And then on the steering wheel, you've got about 5 buttons to the left of the wheel and about 5 buttons to the right of the wheel, and they've got all these really confusing icons on them as well that really don't help to illustrate what they actually do. And then the worst things I find are the indicator stalks, because the indicator stalks are just chock-a-block full of these icons that I assume are supposed to help me understand what they do, but they literally just confuse me more than anything. I mean, a lot of the icons look like they should be telling me, oh, well, this is to handle your cruising distance behind a car in front when you're on the motorway, but actually it's to do with adjusting how fast your windscreen wipers are moving. And then on the left-hand stalk, they have a similar icon, but it's actually for controlling the lights and things. So it's just all over the place. And then on top of that, you've got like buttons at the end of the stalks themselves, which also do different functions, and you're just like, what is going on? You know, I mean, the Tesla literally has 2 buttons on the steering wheel and that's it. Now, the actual infotainment system itself is fine. It's nice and easy to use. You've got loads of different apps. You've got your sat nav, you've got your radio, you've got traffic, you've got all your vehicle settings. You can go in here, full link, and it's got connections with Android Auto and Apple CarPlay and all these different things. So it is actually fully functional. Now, one thing I would say is, on the Tesla, because its screen is so big and it's so high resolution, using something like a sat nav on the Tesla is much easier. On this, simply because the screen is so much smaller, it's actually a bit more difficult to see where you need to go, especially, for example, if you're in a city like this, because all the roads are very small and it's kind of difficult to see which turn off you actually need to take, just because the screen is so small. So now that we're coming towards the end of the drive, there is one other aspect of driving an ICE vehicle in comparison to the Tesla that I noticed, and I actually noticed it straight away shortly after getting the car, because as soon as I got it, I drove a couple of miles and then the oil warning light came on. So on the Tesla there isn't any oil in it, so you're never going to get something like that. But on this, I got the oil warning light, so I had to pull into the nearest petrol station right away and basically get out of the car, get some oil from the shop, and then try and fill it up. And while I was doing that, obviously I had to open up the bonnet and look inside of the engine, and then obviously take out the dipstick and see how much oil was left inside the engine. But while I was in there, the one really significant thing that I noticed was just how complex the engine actually is. I mean, there's so many different moving parts. You've got fan belts, you've got fans, you've got electric motors, you've got piping, you've got coolant systems. You've all these different parts, all these different moving parts, and they all need to work together in order for the engine to work properly. Whereas in the Tesla, there's nothing. There's nothing underneath the bonnet. I literally throw in my baggage, like my backpack and stuff, in the Tesla underneath the bonnet. Whereas on this, you've got this immensely complicated group of different systems that are trying to work together to make the car go. And it's just something that I really quickly realized, is that there's just so many more things in this to go wrong than there is in any electric car, for example, and including the Tesla. So that about concludes my 1 week test of an internal combustion engine car versus my Tesla Model 3. What did I learn? A huge number of different things. Definitely number one, being able to travel long distance without having to worry about pulling into a charging station and waiting for an hour for your car to charge. That was definitely one massive advantage that this car has over my Tesla. And I know a lot of people say, oh well, I mean, your Tesla has 350 kilometers of range. When are you ever going to be doing journeys like that? Well, for someone like me, I do actually drive long distance quite often. And in those situations, like for the time that I went to Donegal 2 weeks ago, it really was a hassle to just have to try and plan out where all the charging stations were. And especially when I arrived at some charging stations, the fact that they were broken, and the fact that there were also a very few number of fast charging stations up in the northwest of the country, it just makes it a lot less practical when, for example, you want to go on a staycation in a situation like this. With regards to everything else, I actually didn't think the touchscreen was that much of a difference. I was expecting it to have way more of an impact on me, but actually an 8-inch touchscreen is fine, and when you have things like Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, you're fine with Spotify and stuff. You don't necessarily miss Netflix, because any situation where you'd use Netflix in the Tesla, like when you're charging, you just wouldn't do in a car like this. In terms of driving dynamics, definitely the power was a huge drawback in this versus the Tesla. And obviously, yes, I know it's a €23,000 car or whatever, but just with regards to internal combustion engine cars in general, not having that instant torque and instant acceleration, and also not having that single pedal control over your speed, acceleration and braking, it definitely makes a huge difference, both in terms of the smoothness of your drive and also your driving efficiency, and just how convenient and easy it is to drive a car with one foot as opposed to having to mess around with 3 different pedals. So yeah, I mean, there are pros and cons to both approaches, but definitely considering overall, I cannot wait to go back to my Tesla, just because it's so much nicer to drive, it's so much more powerful, so much smoother, and yeah, the tech is just a lot better. So yeah, that concludes my ICE test for this week, and next week we'll be back to our usual Tesla-centric videos, so I can't wait to show you what's next. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.